My dad publicly told everyone I could never achieve anything. I said he was right, then drove away in the car that he could only dream of. Then he rewrote the story and claimed he contributed to my success. The family barbecue had been going exactly as expected until my father decided to make a scene. We were standing in my parents' backyard surrounded by aunts, uncles, cousins, and family friends who'd known me since childhood. My father had been drinking since noon, and his filter had completely disappeared by 3 o'clock in the afternoon. "You think you're so special with your fancy job and your expensive car?" Dennis shouted loud enough that conversations across the yard stopped. "But I know the truth. You'll never amount to anything. You're just pretending to be successful." Every eye in the yard turned to watch this confrontation. My mother looked mortified. My younger brother Kevin smirked from where he stood by the grill. This was the validation he'd been waiting for. Dad finally putting me in my place. I could have argued. I could have listed my accomplishments, defended my success, pointed out the objective evidence that I had in fact amounted to quite a lot. But I'd learned something valuable over the years. You can't win an argument with someone who's emotionally invested in you failing. So instead, I smiled, calm, genuine, unbothered. "Maybe you're right, Dad." The confusion that crossed his face was perfect. He'd expected anger, defensiveness, maybe tears. Agreement wasn't part of his script. I turned around, walked through the suddenly silent crowd, and got into my Porsche 911 Carrera. Guards red because subtlety had never been my strong suit. I didn't look back as I started the engine, didn't check the rearview mirror as I drove away from my childhood home for what I suspected would be the last time. The drive back to my downtown loft took 40 minutes. I spent it in silence, processing the years of tension that had finally reached their breaking point. By the time I pulled into my building's garage, I felt lighter than I had in months. Hours later, my phone buzzed with a text from my Uncle Marcus. "Do you know what he did after you left?" I stared at the message for a moment before typing back, "What?" What my father didn't know when he made that scene was that his public humiliation attempt had just cost him something he valued far more than our relationship. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me explain how we got here. I'm Ryan Ashford, 33 years old, and I'm a partner at a venture capital firm specializing in technology startups. I make about $800,000 annually between salary bonuses and carried interest from successful investments. The Porsche was a gift to myself after our firm's most recent exit netted me a $2.3 million payout. My father, Dennis Ashford, is a middle manager at a manufacturing company. He makes about $75,000 a year and has worked at the same company for 30 years. There's nothing wrong with that career. It's honest work that provided for our family growing up. But Dennis has always been bitter that he never achieved more. And that bitterness turned toxic when I started succeeding. My younger brother Kevin is 28 and works in sales at a car dealership. He makes decent money when he's motivated, but he's never been particularly driven. What he lacks in ambition, he makes up for in being exactly the son my father wanted. Interested in sports, working-class values, skeptical of education and corporate types. I was always different. I liked school, pursued higher education, went into finance instead of manufacturing or trades. Every choice I made diverged from what Dennis considered the right path, and every success I achieved was treated as evidence that I thought I was better than the family. The tension had been building for years. When I got my MBA, Dennis told everyone I was wasting money on a useless degree. When I got my first job in finance, he said I'd be fired within a year for not knowing real work. When I made partner at 31, he claimed I must have cheated or slept my way there. Nothing I accomplished was ever legitimate in his eyes. It was always luck or connections or something other than my actual abilities. And Kevin reinforced this narrative constantly, making jokes about my pretend job and how I'd probably end up broke once people figured out I was a fraud. My mother, Patricia, never defended me. She'd make excuses for Dennis's behavior, saying he was just joking or didn't mean it the way it sounded. She'd ask me to be understanding, to not take things personally, to remember that he was my father and he loved me even if he had trouble showing it. I tried for years to maintain the relationship. I attended family events, sent gifts on birthdays and holidays, invited them to my apartment for dinners. They usually declined. I kept showing up, kept trying, kept hoping that eventually my success would be enough to earn their respect. The barbecue was supposed to be a celebration of my parents' 35th wedding anniversary. I'd offered to host it at a nice restaurant, my treat, but Dennis had refused. "We don't need your charity," he'd said. So they'd planned a backyard barbecue instead, and I'd shown up with an expensive bottle of wine and a card with a generous check. The trouble started when my cousin Aiden asked about my car. He's 17, interested in automotive engineering, and genuinely excited to hear about the Porsche's specs. I was explaining the differences between the various 911 models when Dennis walked over. "Must be nice to waste money on toys while your parents are struggling," he said loudly. I turned to him confused. "Struggling with what? Do you need money?" "We don't need anything from you," he snapped. "But it's interesting that you can afford a $150,000 car while your brother is working his ass off at the dealership trying to make ends meet." Kevin was within earshot, and he looked uncomfortable rather than grateful for the defense. He knew as well as I did that he made decent money and lived comfortably. This wasn't about Kevin's finances. It was about Dennis's resentment. "Dad, I work hard for my money. The car is something I saved for and earned." "Saved for? You push papers around and call it work. Try doing real labor sometime, then talk to me about earning things." Several relatives had stopped their conversations to watch. I could see my mother approaching, her face already set in that pleading expression that meant she wanted me to let it go. "I'm not doing this here," I said quietly. "It's your anniversary party. Let's just drop it." "Of course you want to drop it. You don't like being called out on your—" That's when he launched into the speech about me never amounting to anything, and I made the choice to walk away instead of engaging. The drive home had given me time to think, and by the time Uncle Marcus texted, I'd made several decisions about how to handle the situation. Marcus's follow-up text came through. "After you left, Dennis started ranting about how disrespectful you were. Then Patricia told him she'd had enough of him attacking you, and they got into a huge fight in front of everyone. She left with your Aunt Julie and hasn't come home yet. He's been calling me asking if I know where she is." I stared at that message for a long moment. My mother had finally stood up to him. After years of making excuses and asking me to understand his behavior, she'd actually defended me. Another text from Marcus. "She told him he'd driven away the only successful person in the family, and she was ashamed of how he treats you. Then she said, if he can't be proud of his son, he doesn't deserve to have one." It was brutal. My phone rang. "Dennis?" I declined the call. He called again immediately. I declined again and blocked his number. Then my mother called from Aunt Julie's phone. I answered, "Ryan, honey, I'm so sorry." Her voice was thick with tears. "I should have said something years ago. I should have stood up for you instead of making excuses for his behavior." "Where are you?" "At Julie's house. I told your father I needed space to think about things. Ryan, what he said today was unforgivable. In front of the whole family treating you like that when you've worked so hard and accomplished so much." The emotion in her voice was genuine, but I'd heard apologies before that didn't lead to change. "What happens next, Mom?" "I don't know, but I know I can't keep pretending his behavior is acceptable. You're my son, and you deserve better than what he's given you." We talked for another 20 minutes. She asked about my life, my work, things she'd never shown much interest in before. She apologized repeatedly for enabling Dennis's treatment of me. She said she was proud of me, words I'd waited decades to hear from either parent. When we hung up, I felt oddly empty. The validation I'd wanted for so long had finally come, but it arrived damaged by years of neglect. Better late than never, I suppose. But the years couldn't be recovered. My phone buzzed again. Kevin this time. "Dude, what the fuck did you do? Mom and Dad are losing it," I typed back. "I didn't do anything. I left when Dad made a scene. Whatever happened after that is on him. Mom's saying she might leave him. This is insane." Maybe it's been insane for a while and everyone just pretended it wasn't. Kevin didn't respond. The truth was uncomfortable for him too. He'd benefited from being the favored son, the one who didn't threaten Dennis's ego by being too successful. Acknowledging that meant acknowledging he'd participated in the family dynamic that made me the scapegoat. I poured myself a drink and sat on my balcony watching the city lights. The Porsche sat in the garage below the symbol that had triggered today's explosion. I'd bought it because I wanted it, because I'd earned it, because I could. The fact that it made my father angry had been a deterrent. Actually, I'd hesitated on the purchase specifically because I knew it would cause problems. But you know what? I was tired of making myself smaller to avoid threatening fragile egos. I'd worked hard, made good decisions, built a successful career. If that made other people uncomfortable, that was their problem to solve, not mine. The realization was freeing. For years, I'd been trying to earn acceptance from people who were fundamentally unable to give it. Dennis's self-worth was tied up in being the authority, the provider, the successful one. My success challenged that narrative, so it had to be dismissed, minimized, or attacked. I'd been fighting an unwinnable battle. You can't logic someone out of a position they didn't logic themselves into. Dennis's contempt for my achievements wasn't based on facts or reality. It was based on his own insecurities and failures. No amount of success on my part would change that. The next morning, I woke to find 17 missed calls from Dennis and a series of increasingly angry voicemails. I deleted them all without listening. Patricia had sent a text asking if we could meet for coffee. I agreed. We met at a cafe near her hotel. She checked into a hotel rather than stay with Julie indefinitely. She looked exhausted, older somehow. "Your father wants you to call him," she started. "I'm not doing that. Ryan, Mom, he's had 33 years to treat me with basic respect. Yesterday he chose to publicly humiliate me instead. I'm done giving him opportunities to do it again." Patricia's eyes filled with tears. "I know I've enabled his behavior. I thought if I kept the peace, if I smoothed things over, eventually he'd come around and see how wonderful you are. That's not how it works. He doesn't want to see it. My success makes him feel bad about himself, so he has to tear it down to protect his ego. What do I do?" The question surprised me. "That's not my decision to make. You need to decide what kind of relationship you're willing to accept. But I can tell you what I've decided. I'm not going to keep showing up to be attacked. If Dad wants a relationship with me, he needs to genuinely apologize and change his behavior. Not just say sorry, but actually treat me differently. Until that happens, I'm done. He's your father, and I'm his son. That works both ways. He doesn't get to use our relationship as a weapon against me and then hide behind it when there are consequences." We talked for another hour. Patricia asked about my work, my life, my plans. She listened in a way she never had before. Actually engaged rather than waiting for her turn to defend Dennis or change the subject. When we parted, she hugged me tightly. "I'm proud of you, Ryan. I should have said that more often. I should have said it always." Over the following weeks, the family situation played out in predictable ways. Dennis called from different numbers trying to reach me. I blocked each one. He showed up at my building once. Security sent him away when I told them I didn't want to see him. He sent emails alternating between anger and self-pity. Some claimed I had betrayed the family. Others said I was abandoning him when he needed me most. None of them actually apologized for the years of contempt and dismissal. Kevin tried to mediate, suggesting we work things out like men. I asked him what there was to work out. Did he think what Dad said was acceptable? Kevin hemmed and hawed, trying to find a middle ground that didn't exist. You either thought publicly humiliating your son was wrong or you didn't. There was no compromised position. Uncle Marcus kept me updated on the family drama. Apparently Dennis had told everyone that I'd abandoned the family because I thought I was too good for them now. Some relatives believed him. Others had been at the barbecue and seen what actually happened. The family fractured along predictable lines. People who'd always been kind to me reached out to say they supported me. People who'd always been more aligned with Dennis's worldview sided with him, repeating his narrative about my arrogance and abandonment. I let them believe whatever they needed to believe. The truth was on full display at that barbecue for anyone who'd been paying attention. If they chose Dennis's revisionist history over what they'd witnessed, that told me everything I needed to know about where I stood with them. Patricia stayed at the hotel for 3 weeks before finally going back home. She called to let me know, her voice heavy with resignation. "I'm not strong enough to leave him," she admitted. 35 years is too much to walk away from." "I understand," I said, and I did. Leaving a marriage is complicated, especially at her age and after that many years. But I need you to understand that I can't keep subjecting myself to Dad's behavior. "I know. I won't ask you to come to family events if he's there. I'll meet you separately if you're willing." We made plans for dinner the following week, just the two of us. It wasn't ideal, but it was more than I'd had before, a relationship with my mother that didn't require enduring abuse from my father. Meanwhile, work was going exceptionally well. One of our portfolio companies was preparing for an IPO that would likely net me another 7-figure payout. I'd been asked to speak at an industry conference about early-stage investing. My career was thriving precisely because I'd focused my energy on things I could control rather than trying to win approval from people determined not to give it. 3 months after the barbecue incident, I ran into Kevin at a coffee shop. It wasn't planned. We both happened to be there at the same time. "Hey," he said awkwardly. "Hey, can we talk?" I gestured to the empty seat across from me. He sat down, looking uncomfortable. "I've been thinking about what happened at the barbecue," Kevin started, "and about how Dad treats you in general. Okay? I think I've been a dick about it too, making jokes about your job, acting like what you do isn't real work. I was feeding into Dad's because it was easier than admitting he was wrong." The admission surprised me. "What changed?" "I was at dinner with him and Mom last week. He was going off about you, same old stuff. and I realized I couldn't actually defend anything he was saying. Like, objectively, you're successful. You make good money. You worked hard to get where you are. There's no legitimate criticism there. It's just resentment. And you're just now figuring this out. Kevin had the grace to look ashamed. I know, I should have seen it years ago, but it's easier to go along with someone else's narrative than to challenge your own parents, you know. I didn't know. I'd spent years trying to win Dennis's approval before finally accepting it would never come. Where do we go from here? Kevin asked. That depends on what you want. I'm not interested in being the family punching bag anymore. If you want a relationship with me, it needs to be one where you actually respect what I do and don't participate in Dad's attacks. I can do that. I want to do that. We talked for another hour. Kevin asked about my work, actually listened to the answers, asked follow-up questions that showed genuine interest. He apologized specifically for jokes he'd made over the years. He acknowledged that he'd benefited from being the favored son while I'd been treated as the disappointment. It wasn't a complete reconciliation, but it was a start. I left that coffee shop feeling like I might eventually have a relationship with my brother that was based on mutual respect rather than family obligation. 6 months after the barbecue, Dennis had a health scare. Nothing life-threatening, but serious enough that he spent a few days in the hospital for tests. Patricia called to let me know. Do you want to visit him? She asked carefully. Has he apologized? He says he wants to talk to you. That's not the same thing as apologizing. Patricia sighed. I know, but he's scared. Ryan, the health scare, has him thinking about mortality, about his relationships. I'll think about it. I did think about it. I thought about showing up at the hospital having some deathbed reconciliation where Dennis finally acknowledged my worth. It would be a nice narrative, the prodigal son returning the father, finally seeing the light. But that wasn't reality. Reality was 33 years of contempt, dismissal, and attacks. Reality was being told in front of the entire family that I'd never amount to anything because my success threatened my father's ego. One health scare didn't erase that history. And wanting to talk wasn't the same as taking responsibility for years of cruelty. I didn't visit. I sent flowers to the hospital room with a card that said, "Wishing you a speedy recovery." Professional, appropriate, and completely devoid of the emotional vulnerability Dennis would have used as ammunition later. He recovered and was home within a week. Patricia said he was angry I hadn't visited. I didn't respond to that information. His anger was his to manage, not mine to fix. A year after the barbecue, my life looked completely different from how it had the day of that confrontation. I'd stopped attending family events. I'd built stronger relationships with the relatives who'd actually supported me. I'd focused my energy on my career, my friends, my own well-being. The Porsche that had triggered such anger, I drove it every day without guilt. It was a symbol of my success earned through hard work and good decisions. The fact that it made insecure people uncomfortable was their problem, not mine. I'd learned something valuable through the whole experience. You can't make people value you who are invested in not valuing you. Dennis needed me to fail to protect his own ego. No amount of success would change that fundamental dynamic. So I stopped trying. I stopped showing up to be attacked. I stopped making myself smaller to avoid threatening fragile egos. I stopped accepting the narrative that my achievements were somehow proof of arrogance rather than evidence of hard work. And you know what? Life got better, dramatically better, without the constant weight of trying to win impossible approval. I had energy for things that actually mattered. My career flourished. My relationships with supportive people deepened. My mental health improved. The best revenge wasn't proving my father wrong. It was building a life so successful and fulfilling that his opinion became irrelevant. He could think I'd never amount to anything all he wanted. The reality was, I'd already amounted to quite a lot, and I'd done it without his support or approval. Uncle Marcus texted me on the anniversary of the barbecue. You ever regret how that day went down? I thought about it honestly before responding. I regret that it took me so long to walk away. But walking away, that's the best decision I ever made. 2 years after the incident, I bought a house. Not just any house, a stunning modern property in an exclusive neighborhood. The kind of place that gets featured in architecture magazines. The down payment alone was more than my father made in 2 years. I didn't tell the family about it. They found out through social media when one of my friends posted photos from the housewarming party. Patricia called crying, saying she wished she could have been there. You could have been, I said gently. You chose to stay with someone who treats your son like garbage. That's your choice and I respect it, but choices have consequences. Dennis sent an email claiming I was flaunting my wealth to make him feel bad. I deleted it without responding. His feelings weren't my responsibility. The house was beautiful. I'd earned it. I'd worked hard for it, and I was going to enjoy it without guilt or apology. Kevin visited a few times. Our relationship had slowly rebuilt into something genuine. He'd started his own business with my advice and a small loan I'd provided. He was doing well, and he'd stopped participating in Dennis's narrative about me. "Dad asks about you sometimes," Kevin mentioned during one visit. "Does he?" "Yeah, I think he's starting to realize what he lost." "What he threw away?" "You mean he had a son who was successful and wanted a relationship with him. He chose resentment over pride, attacks over support. That's on him." "Would you ever forgive him?" I considered the question. Forgiveness and reconciliation are different things. I can forgive him for being too insecure to celebrate my success, but I'm not going to subject myself to more abuse just because we share DNA. 3 years after the barbecue, one of my investments hit it big. A startup I'd backed in the early stages was acquired by a major tech company for $400 million. My share of the payout was $8.7 million. The news made the business section of several newspapers. I did an interview with a trade publication about early-stage investing. My name was out there associated with major success in the venture capital world. The family saw it? Of course they did. Extended relatives started reaching out, many of them the same ones who'd sided with Dennis after the barbecue. Suddenly they were interested in my life, wanted to reconnect, asked if I had any investment opportunities they could get in on. I was polite, but distant. Where were they when my father was publicly humiliating me? Nowhere. But now that I had money and connections, suddenly I was worth knowing. Patricia called, proud and excited. "Everyone's talking about your success. Even your father saw the article. And he didn't say much, but I could tell he was processing it." "Processing what?" "That I actually did amount to something despite his predictions. That maybe publicly attacking me was a mistake." "Ryan, Mom, I love you, but I'm not interested in whether Dad is finally coming around to accepting my success. He had 33 years to be proud of me. The fact that he needs 8-figure payouts to consider that maybe I'm not a failure tells me everything about what he values." The conversation ended awkwardly. I knew I was being harsh, but I was also being honest. Dennis's potential change of heart wasn't about recognizing my worth. It was about being impressed by a dollar amount large enough to overcome his resentment. 5 years after the barbecue, I was invited to speak at a major industry conference. The keynote speaker had canceled last minute and they'd asked me to step in. The topic was building wealth through strategic investing, and the audience included some of the biggest names in finance. I agreed to do it. The speech went exceptionally well, and afterwards several major publications asked for interviews. One of them was the local newspaper from my hometown. I did the interview. I talked about my background, my education, my career trajectory. I mentioned growing up in a working-class family and not having family money to back my early career. I talked about student loans, entry-level positions, working my way up. The article was published with the headline, "Local Success Story, How Ryan Ashford Built an 8-Figure Fortune from Scratch." Dennis saw it. Of course he did. Everyone in his social circle saw it. His coworkers, his neighbors, people he'd known for decades. According to Uncle Marcus, Dennis had been bragging about it. "That's my son," he told people. "Always knew he'd be successful." The revisionist history was breathtaking. The same man who'd publicly declared I'd never amount to anything was now taking credit for my success. Marcus asked if I wanted to set the record straight. I thought about it. I could tell people what Dennis had actually said and done. I could expose his lies and make sure everyone knew he'd actively worked against my success rather than supporting it. But what would that accomplish? The people who mattered knew the truth. The people who didn't matter would believe whatever narrative was most comfortable for them. "Let him tell whatever story he needs to tell," I said to Marcus. "It doesn't change the reality." The reality was that I'd built everything without Dennis's support. The reality was that he'd been actively hostile to my success until it became too large to dismiss. The reality was that I'd proven him spectacularly wrong about my potential, and no amount of revisionist history could change that. I'm 38 now, 5 years after that barbecue confrontation. My net worth is approaching $20 million. I'm a managing partner at my firm with decision-making authority over a $500 million fund. I speak at conferences regularly, contribute to industry publications, and serve on the boards of several successful companies. I drive a different Porsche, now a Taycan Turbo S, because I wanted something electric and fast. I have the house, the career, the life I built through hard work and smart decisions. Dennis and I haven't spoken since that day at the barbecue. He sent emails over the years, usually when he wants something or when my success becomes too public to ignore. I don't respond to them. Patricia and I have dinner once a month. She's still with Dennis, still making excuses for his behavior, but she's also carved out a separate relationship with me that doesn't include him. It's not ideal, but it works. Kevin and I are close now. He's built his own success running a thriving business and making good money. We talk regularly, help each other out, maintain the kind of adult-sibling relationship I'd always wanted but couldn't have while he was participating in Dennis's narrative. Looking back on that moment standing in my parents' backyard listening to my father declare I'd never amount to anything, choosing to walk away rather than defend myself, I see it as the turning point that freed me from a dynamic that had been holding me back for decades. I stopped fighting for approval that would never come. I stopped making myself smaller to avoid threatening fragile egos. I stopped accepting the premise that my success was somehow proof of arrogance rather than evidence of capability. And in doing so, I gave myself permission to succeed without guilt, to build without apologizing to achieve, without constantly justifying my right to do so. The text from Uncle Marcus that day asked what Dennis did after I left. The answer was predictable. He raged. He blamed me. He created a narrative where he was the victim of my abandonment. But the more interesting question is what I did after I left. And the answer to that is simple. I lived my life on my own terms, built success that couldn't be dismissed or minimized, and proved through results rather than words that I'd amounted to something significant. Dennis was right about one thing, though perhaps not in the way he meant it. I didn't amount to the person he thought I should be. The son who stayed small, who worked a traditional job, who never threatened his ego by succeeding too much. I amounted to something far better. Myself fully realized, successful on my own terms, and completely free from the need for his approval. The Porsche I drove away in that day was just a car, but symbolically, it represented everything Dennis couldn't accept. Visible, undeniable evidence that I'd succeeded despite his predictions, exceeded his expectations, and built something impressive without his support or approval. 5 years later, I'm still driving away not from a barbecue, but from the limiting beliefs and toxic dynamics that held me back for so long. And every mile I drive, every success I achieve, every goal I reach is proof that sometimes the best response to being told you'll never amount to anything is to smile, walk away, and go build something extraordinary. Maybe he was right. Maybe I never did amount to the failure he needed me to be, and I'm perfectly fine with that.